Chapter 14. Next year, at the beginning of Lent, Thorhild Bjornsdatter moved home to Rundmere, and at once it was over the whole countryside that she had to leave Hestviken so suddenly because she was to have a child by Olav Audunsson. If such a misfortune had befallen another man, who had been as a widower for years with a sick wife living, no one would have spoken aloud of the matter. But all the best men and women of the neighbourhood would have given thoughtless youths and those who knew nothing of good manners to understand that the less there was said about it, the better. Olaf knew that. But he also knew that he was the man, and that he was regarded almost as a sort of outcast. Not that he had ever wronged any of his neighbours, so far as he knew. And at times folk had remembered this. When they thought it over, they knew of no particular stain on his name. No ugly or dishonourable action could be laid at his door. Olav Audunsson had simply acquired the reputation of being unpopular, a most uncongenial fellow. In the brief days of sunshine after Cecilia had come into the world, before it became clear that her birth had cost the mother the last remnant of her health, the folk of the country round had met Olaf with good will. Now that this strange curse had been lifted, that denied them living children at Hestviken, his equals had rejoiced with him, and they had thought that now perhaps the man would be more sociable, not such a killjoy as he had been. He extinguished life and merriment around him simply by the way he sat in silence, glaring with unseeing eyes in good company. But Olaf seemed so little able to meet them halfway. He remained the most arrant cross-stick with whom nobody could get on. Then there came to light this matter, which was as ugly as need be. While his life lay palsied and full of torment, broken by one childbirth after another, each harder than the last, the man had been whoring with his housekeeper under his own roof. They had known it for years, folk called to mind now. This man and that knew that Olaf had often brought his servant gifts from the town, far too costly for her position. He had helped her to provide for Bjorn's and Gudrid's children, and all the time he had worked the land for her up at Rundmere, where she had now betaken herself again. It was no long way between Rundmere and Hestviken, so they showed no great shame. Folk had seen Thorhild swaying about in broad daylight, broad as she was now below the belt. She carried pails between her cot and the byre. Far abroad she went along the edge of the wood, chipping bark and cutting twigs. While they were about it, folk dug up again all the talk there had been of Bjorn Egilson and Gudrid. Olaf's nearest kinsfolk in the neighbourhood, Signy of Skikjostad and Una of Ringjal, had taken his part all through and done their best to excuse their cousin. But now even they were silent, and looked ill at ease if anyone did but name Olaf of Hestviken. Olaf knew most of what was said of him and Thorhild. When he had made his confession, Sire Halbjorn asked if that was all, and then he discovered what kind of rumours were afloat about him. That this affair between him and Thorhild had been going on for years, and that some folk hinted that maybe he was also father to the child Liv Torbjornsdatter had had a year or two ago out at Hestviken. One of the first Sundays when he was not permitted to ride to church with other people, the weather was mild. Olaf was walking about the yard. A great wash-tub stood there. It had thawed so much that there was water on the top of the ice. Olaf chanced to bend over it and saw his own reflection in the water. The face that looked up at him from the dark depth of the vessel, blurred and somewhat indistinct, was like the face of a leper. His pallor showed like patches of rime frost against the weather-beaten skin, and the whites of his eyes were red with blood. Olaf was frightened at the sight of himself. He had almost expected it to come as a relief in a way, when he was forbidden to enter the church this year. In the end he had felt he could no longer endure to go to Mass with his unshriven sin. But for all that it was worse to be shut out. He had thought that the heavy penance for his adultery would at the same time heal some of his old wound. But it only caused him to reflect that this last sin was but a consummation of the old sin. But this was the last thing in which he had ventured to put trust in himself, that nothing on earth would be able to break down his fidelity to Ingunn. Not a word had been spoken between them of his faithlessness, but he knew that she knew of it. The beginning of it all was that he felt all at once that he could no longer bear the burden of Ingunn. After that day in the previous spring, when he had told her that he could no longer live with the deadly sin stirring in his mind, begetting fresh sins from day to day, and she begged him to go on enduring it for the boy's sake and hers. And in her sick and tortured state she had the advantage. No man worth calling a man could have opposed such a living bundle of pain. He could not humiliate himself so far as to broach the subject again. He made as though nothing had been said, helped her through the long nights as before. But now, when at last his heart had run dry of love and patience, it was far more trying. Now not a day passed, but he felt how tired and worn he was from the endless watching in the air of the sick-room. And the great bitterness in his heart received constant accessions of petty bitterness. Every time he found himself growing sluggish and forgetful in his work, heavy and inactive of body. One night before midsummer he had gone out toward morning. Ingunn had fallen asleep at last, and he wished for a breath of the cool night air before lying down. Olav paused before the door of the house. It was light, calm and grey outside. The boat's crew were not expected home for some hours yet. All on the manor were asleep. Then he noticed a thin column of smoke above the roof of the cookhouse. At that moment Torhild Bjornsdatter appeared at its door and emptied a cooking pot. Her wet hair hung about her, dark and straggling. Olav had always been strangely touched to see how Torhild strove to keep herself clean and tidy, in spite of all she had to do. She was always first up and last in bed, and thus she found time to wash and plait her hair even in the middle of the week, and mend her clothes. Ingunn had given up all such things before they had been married 4 years. Olav went across to Torhild, and they spoke together for a while, instinctively whispering, as it was so still. Not a sound but that of the birds beginning to wake. He had dozed a little at times, he said in answer to her questions, but now he would go in and lie down. "Why don't you come over to us and lie down in my bed?" asked the girl. "Then you would have more peace." She herself and the children lay in one of the lofts now that it was summer. Torhild lived in the house that Olav's parents had had when they were first married. It was a little old house which stood a little way apart in a line with the cattle sheds, under the horse crag, on the east of the yard toward the valley. Olav had had it set in order, so that it was now good and weather-tight, but it was very cramped inside. Torhild accompanied him to the house and drew out the cudgel with which she had bolted the door. The air from within smote him like a sweet breath. The floor was strewed with juniper. The room was so narrow that the bed at its end filled it from wall to wall. In the dim light its sheepskin covers shone white as snow. Around it were hung wreaths of flowers to keep off flies and vermin. Torhild had made it all trim before she moved out for the summer. She bade him sit on the edge of the bed while she pulled off his shoes. Olav felt sleep well up from this clean, fresh couch, rising about him like sweet, tepid water. He was already half asleep as he rolled over into the bed, was just aware that Thorhild lifted his feet in and spread the coverlet over him. When he came to himself again, he saw the evening sun shining yellow on the meadow outside the front door. Thorhild stood over him with a bowl in her hands. It was fresh, warm milk. He drank and drank. "You got some sleep?" asked Thorhild. She took the empty bowl and went out. His shoes stood before the bed. They were soft, well smeared with tallow, and a clean everyday jerkin was laid out for him, still damp across the chest where she had washed away the stains, and the tear was mended that had been there when he wore it last. During the summer it happened more and more often that he went and lay down in Thorhild's house to get a night's sleep. But each time he rested thus made it harder to go back to the nights of watching. He was fairly hungry for sleep, and more sleep. He could not have had his fill of sleep for many years, he thought. Thorhild brought him his morning bread when she came to wake him. If his clothes were wet the night before, he found dry ones ready when he woke. Holes and tears were mended. Olav asked her not to do this. It was Leif's work, though she seldom did it. Thorhild had enough to do as it was. The girl gave a little smile and shook her head. And then there arose in him a desire for her, to know for once in his life what it was like to hold a sound and healthy woman in his arms, one he need not be afraid of touching. But for all that, it was as though he had never willed it. Even that morning, when he had reached out and took hold of her, he had expected her to thrust him away, perhaps in anger. But she yielded to him without a sigh. All through the autumn and winter he seemed to be walking at the bottom of a thick sea of mist. He could not bear himself, and sometimes he could not bear her either. But he had no force to pull himself out of the mire. When she moved back into her house with the children, it must surely come to an end, he comforted himself. But it did not. He stayed indoors with Ingunn from early in the morning till late in the evening. He had not been away from home a night, except for a week in the seal hunting. Now that he had betrayed his wife, he remembered his bitterness toward her as a temptation of the devil to which he had yielded. "Ingunn, my Ingunn, how could I treat you thus, while you lie here, patient and kind, helpless as a maimed animal? Was that to be the end of our friendship, that I turned traitor to you?" Night after night Olav carried her, wrapped in skins and blankets, as one carries a child, so that she might have some relief from the stress of lying in bed. The more weary and cold and sleepless it made him, the greater was the relief he got from it. He and Thorhild had scarcely exchanged a word since that fatal morning. In all these years Thorhild had been almost the only person with whom Olav had much talk, as with a grown-up equal. He remembered that, remembered what he owed this Thorhild, whom he had rewarded in this way. He could find nothing to excuse his misdeed. She had known no man before him. All she had known was hard work for other folks' welfare, and to make no complaint if life was too hard for her. And now he durst not speak to her, checked her when she would speak. In his heart he knew full well what she had long treasured up, and why this upright and scrupulous woman, who was no longer young, had allowed him to possess her without resistance. He was aware of it in her silent caresses. But if she once forgot herself and put it into words, his shame would stifle him. Of Bjorn, her father, he also thought. If he had been alive now, he would have cut him down straight. He guessed that it would not remain hidden either. It was in the darkest days before Yule that his fear changed to certainty. And in his despair, temptation came to him. It was as though the devil, who had led him for all these years into an ever-increasing slough, going before him cloaked and half disguised, had now turned about, thrown off his hood of concealment, and shown him his true face. He knew that Thorhild would do whatever he asked of her. In former years it had often happened that they had been out together in a boat alone. She would go with him again. Even if she guessed what was in his mind, she would follow him. He felt that. And then something might easily happen. And Ingunn would be spared the knowledge of this, and he would be spared the shame of being exposed to every mother's son around the fjord as the worst of wretches. If he was already in the devil's power, neck and crop, he could no longer have a soul to lose. But no, for all that. It was Satan who held out all this to him, but he himself said no. This crime I will not be guilty of, no matter whether you have my chair ready for me in hell. I have nothing to lose, I can well believe that. Honour and hope of salvation, and my happiness with Ingunn, which I had saved so far, all this I have sold. But nevertheless you will not get me to do this. I will not do Thorhild more harm than I have done already, not even for Ingunn's sake. Lord, have mercy. Holy Mary, pray for us. Not for me. I beg nothing for myself, but, Lord, have mercy upon the others. Yes, now it is too late, he said scornfully to the devil. They have guessed it. My whole household has guessed it. So now you may cease to suffer about it. Be quiet. You will get me when the time comes. An ugly silence had fallen about him. The housefolk ceased speaking when the master came near. Scarcely a whispered word was spoken at mealtimes. Olav sat in the high seat. The housekeeper brought in the food and served it out. No one could mark the slightest change in her bearing. She was about from dawn till late in the evening, industrious as ever. Her back was as straight and her foot as nimble, though it was plain to all that she no longer went alone. Ingunn turned her face to the wall when Thorhild came into the room. So much had already gone by of the new year that Lent was at hand, and yet not a word had been said between Olav and Thorhild of that which awaited them. But one day he saw her go up into the storehouse loft after the morning meal. He followed. She was taking pieces of bacon out of the salt barrel and scraping off the worst of the scum that had formed on them. I have been thinking, Thorhild. Olav went straight to the point. I cannot help you much, but I will do what is in my power. And therefore I thought, that farm of Ingunn that I bought over on the Hudaheim side 5 years ago, that I give you a deed of it and make it over to you. Rundmere I can continue to work for you and your brothers and sisters, as we have done in these last years. Thorhild reflected for a moment. Perhaps it may well be better that I do not stay up there at Rundmere. It will surely be better for you if you don't have to live around here, after the trouble I have brought upon you, said the man in a low voice. Are you sure? Ingunn? Thorhild looked at him. That is no small gift to make a woman of my condition, Olav. It was reckoned to be a 3 cows' croft, and there were some good cornfields on the south side of the knoll the houses stand on. But, you know, no one has lived there for a score of years, and they who rented the land from me have not kept it in good tilth. Thorhild turned around to him and held out her hand. Then I say thank you, Olav. I see that you wish to make good provision for me. Olav squeezed her fingers. I have behaved worst to you of all people, he whispered. You had the right to expect a different reward from me. Torhild looked him in the eyes. "The fault is mine, as much as yours, I think, master." He shook his head. Then he said quietly, "Will it not be too hard for you now? All the work of the house here?" "Oh, no," she smiled feebly. "But perhaps it were best that I stay here at Hestviken no longer." Olaf nodded stiffly. "But the houses over at Ingunn are in a sorry state, sunken and roofless. I shall have them repaired and put new roofs on. But you cannot move in before the summer." "Then I must stay at Rundmere meanwhile," Torhild suggested. "Yes, I see no other way," said Olaf. A week after, Olaf left home for a few days, and when he came back, Torhild had moved home to the croft at Rundmere, and Olaf discovered that he missed her unspeakably. It was not that his affection for Ingunn was less or other than it had been. It was something that had grown up entirely outside it. As in a sort of mirage, he had had a vision of a life very different from his own, had seen how it might be for a man to have a sound and sensible wife by his side in all things, one who took her share of their common burden, and bore it with as much discretion and strength as he bore his, or even more. And to see children, sons and daughters, succeeding one another, without its breaking and slowly killing the mother to bring them into the world. It was not that he would have changed his lot for this that the vision showed him. He thought that, even had he known from his first meeting with the child Ingunn what she would bring him as a dowry, he would nevertheless have reached out both hands for her. And yet he missed Torhild painfully. She had done him more good than any other creature, and he had repaid her in the worst way. Eirik had seen how it was with Torhild, like everyone else in the house, and he had not given it much thought. But there was this silence that spread around Torhild, and it began to dawn upon Eirik that there was something sinister behind it. It could not be merely that she had gone the way of so many other serving maids. This silence spread like the soundless rings in water when a stone was thrown into it. And by degrees, without a word having been said to him, Eirik became aware that this same sinister silence surged about his father too. A vague evil dread stirred in the boy's soul, but he could not guess what his father had to do with Torhild's being with child, for his father was married to their mother. Sara Halbjorn sent word to Hestviken that this year Eirik Olafsson must go to confession in Lent and receive the Easter sacrament. The boy was now in his 10th winter. He ought to have come the year before. Eirik forgot all his gloomy anxieties on the morning his father sent him off. The priest wished to have the children with him for a week to teach them. It was the first time Eirik was to ride alone right up to the church town. His father had lent him a little light sword, and behind his saddle he had a bag of gifts for the priest and provisions for himself. The day after his return he asked Olav, "Father, who is my godmother?" "Tora Steinfinnsdatter, your aunt, who is dead." Olaf was not sure of this, but he believed he had heard it once. Eirik asked no more. Memories that he had not thought of for years began to swarm upon the boy. Half-forgotten feelings of insecurity and bewilderment were revived. The other children had spoken of godmothers and godfathers. Sara Halbjorn had wished to hear on the first day how much they knew of Christian religion from their homes. Eirik's father had taught him his credo, Pater Noster, Ave Maria and Gloria Patri, but that was long ago, and now he never saw that the boy said his prayers. So Eirik did not know them well, and he had almost forgotten what they meant in Norse. Nearly all the other children were better taught, and most of them had learnt something from their godmother or godfather. Eirik remembered that while he was at Siljuas, the mother he had there pointed out a stout, splendidly clad woman one day when they were at church, saying that she was his aunt. But she had not so much as looked at him as she walked past them. He was not even sure that she was the same aunt as the one in whose house they had lodged when his father fetched him from Siljuas. At any rate, he had never heard that she was his godmother. For the first time it occurred to him to wonder why he had been there at Siljuas when he was small. He had often heard of other children being brought up away from their parents, but it was always with kinsfolk, solitary people or old. That little maid, Ingunn, who was so pretty and wore a silver belt about her waist like a grown-up maid, only that the plaits were quite small, and who knew all the penitential psalms almost right, she was with her godmother, and she ruled the whole house for the childless couple, and was given everything she asked for. But at Siljuas the cabin had been poor and narrow, and Halvig and Torgal had plenty of other children, and he had never heard his parents mention these folks since, so they could not be kinsfolk of theirs. Bastard and straw brat, he knew well enough now what those words meant, and Leman too. The memory of his mother's visit, which had frightened him so much that time, now it came up again, a living riddle. Words that he had heard his mother murmur almost to herself when she could not hide her tears. They came up, and he remembered that his mother had once borne the keys, but they had been moved to Torhild's belt even before her mistress became bedridden. And now, since his mother had lain low, palsied and unfit for anything, his father had taken to himself Torhild in her stead, and she was already far gone with child, and Eirik guessed now that it was his father's. But if his father had been married, this was a sin so grievous that scarcely any man would dare commit it. But then it must be so that his mother was only his father's leman. But then, that a rich franklin sent away his leman and children, assigned them a little home to dwell in far from his own, while he himself took in another or married, that had happened many times in the country round, and Eirik had heard of it. The boy's heart was gripped by the dread of it, so that he could not sit still or quietly stay in one place. His father might send them away if he wished, and he no longer cared for any of them. It was over a year since his father had taken Eirik about with him. He no longer taught him anything, scarcely spoke to him, nor did he take any notice of Cecilia. And his mother lay there, needing constant attention, and unable to do the merest trifle of work. If his father ordered them, all three, to leave Hestviken, he would bring Torhild and her child hither in their stead. He had always noticed his mother's dislike of Torhild, and never thought about it. Now he saw, and hatred, of which hitherto he had known nothing, was born in the boy's heart. He hated Torhild Bjornsdatter. His cheeks turned white, and he clenched his fists if he did but think of her. He took it into his head that one night he would steal up to Rundmere and kill her, who would force his poor sick mother and all of them out of their home. He would drive his knife straight into her wicked, false heart. But his father! Eirik stood, as it were, with two arrows in his hand, not knowing which to lay to his bow. Should he hate his father too, or love him even more than before, now that he was in danger of losing him? To Eirik, Olav had always appeared the most perfect being on earth. The man's impatience, taciturnity, and coolness had made no impression on the child. He shook them from him as the sea-bird shakes off the water, and thought only of the times when his father had treated him differently. Above all, when they had been out together without other company, in the forest or on the fjord. And his father had been the all-knowing, helpful being who warmed the child and gave him a feeling of security by his own quiet good humour. But even at other times Eirik had often been able to feel that his father wished him well. And then there was that time when his father had cut off his poisoned finger and thrust the red-hot iron into his flesh to show his son there was nothing to be afraid of. To the boy this was such a shining deed that he did not remember it clearly. It dazzled him to think of it. Lose his father? Eirik turned to fire and ice with pain at the thought. Then he had dreams of doing something or other, a manly deed which would bring him fame. He imagined many things, but did not quite know which to choose. But when his father's eyes were opened to the kind of son he had, when he saw that he was bringing up a lad of spirit, when Eirik had won his father's heart, then he would say to him that he claimed an honourable position for his sister and himself, and his father should not send away his mother, were she ever so sick and useless and in the way. But Thorhild he should drive so far away that he need never more fear her coming with her child to claim their place. But even if his affection for his father was more lively than ever, his confidence and sense of security were gone. And now Eirik noticed this, that his father was not fond of him, although the man never corrected him now, scarcely paid heed to him. Olaf hardly ever gave Eirik a thought now, only noticed with a vague relief that the boy was quieter than before, and less in the way. To not a living soul did Eirik so much as hint at the conflict of thoughts that possessed him. At last, one day in the course of spring, Olaf stayed behind when the household went out after the morning meal. And then he said it. "Likely you have heard. Thorhild has a son." He spoke in a low voice which sounded husky. "I have heard it." With a painful effort she turned her head so far as to see a glimpse of her husband as he sat leaning back in the high seat. His face was white and patched with red, his eyes swollen and bloodshot. She guessed he had been weeping. She had not seen him in this way in all these years, not even when Audun died, not when she herself received the last sacraments, that time the women expected her to bleed to death. Only once before had she seen Olaf weep. "What is it like?" whispered his wife. "Thorhild's child?" "Fair and shapely, they say." "Have you not seen your son?" Olaf shook his head. "I have not seen Thorhild, not since she left us." "But surely you will see it." "I can do no more than I have done for her. I cannot amend the boy's lot, and so—" Olaf got up and crossed the room. He was going out. Ingunn called to him. "What name has she given him?" "Bjorn." Ingunn saw that his tears were about to overcome him again. "That was the name of your mother's father." "She can't have known that. It was her father's name too, you know." Olaf made as though he would bend over his wife, but then he turned abruptly and went out. She said no more to him till supper time. From Liv she had heard that he had gone straight off to the smithy in the morning, and no one in the place had seen the master all day. He looked as if he had wept most of the time. Then came the night. Olaf and Ingunn were left alone in the house with Eirik, who was asleep against the wall in his father's bed. The man tended the sick woman as he did all the other nights. Several times his wife saw that he was near bursting into tears again, and not a word did she dare say to him who had now gotten a son, and who could never lead in his own son to sit beside him in the high seat in his ancestral manner. But what of Eirik, when she herself was no more? Ingunn had an obscure feeling that it was only sorrow over his son that had so shattered Olaf. The man himself was not thinking so much of his child. He wept chiefly over himself. It was as though he saw the last remnant of his honour and his pride lying crushed before his feet. Not till after Olav's Mass had Olav Audunsson finished repairing the houses at Ingunn so far that Thorhild Bjornsdatter could move there with her belongings. His housecarls were to carry her and her goods across the fjord. Olav himself had gone off south to Saltviken the day she was to move. Ingunn lay listening. She had had both doors thrown open to the yard. She heard the coming of the pack horses, the hoof-beats on the rock. Then the cowbell, the tripping of little hoofs. The children, Ranvig and Kar, ran about, driving and keeping together their flock of sheep and goats. Liv stood at the outer door, sniffing and joking about the procession. "Thorhild takes the lower path along the creek," announced the maid, buzzing with excitement. "To bring her horse son among the houses here. That's more than she even has a mind to." "Hush, Liv," whispered Ingunn, breathing rapidly. "Run down to her, bid her. Tell her I would like to have a sight of her child." A moment later Eirik dashed in hurriedly. His narrow, swarthy face was burning. His yellow eyes sparkled with indignation. "Mother, now she is coming here. Shall I drive her off? We must not let the filthy hell sow drag her bastard in here." "Eirik, Eirik!" His mother called to him in a wail, stretching out her thin yellow hand. "For God's sake, don't say such things. 'Tis a sin to scoff at a poor creature and call her bad names." He was so tall now, her boy, slender as a reed and slight of build. Angrily he tossed his shapely head with its black curls. "I sent for her," whispered Ingunn. The boy frowned and turned on his heel. Then he went and flung himself down on the edge of the north bed, sat there staring with an angry, scornful smile as Thorhild entered. The girl came forward with bent head. She had bound up her hair under a coarse, tight-drawn coif, but her back was as straight as ever. She carried a bundle in her arms, wrapped in a kerchief with a red and white border. It was strange to see that she bore herself with all her old dignity and calm, even as she appeared before Olav's wife, humble and sorrowful. The women greeted one another, and Ingunn remarked that Thorhild would have good weather for the passage across. Thorhild agreed. "I had so great a mind to see your boy," whispered Ingunn shyly. "You must do me the kindness to let me see him. Lay him down here before me. You know I cannot raise myself," she said, as Thorhild held out the bundle. Then the girl laid the child down on the bed before the mistress. With trembling hands Ingunn undid the kerchief that was wrapped about it. The boy was awake. He lay staring at nothing in particular, with wide blue eyes. A little smile, as it were a reflection of a light none but himself could see, hovered about the toothless milky mouth. A fine fair down curled from under the border of his cap. "He is big," said Ingunn, "for his age. 3 months, is it not?" "He will be 3 months by Lawrence Mass." "And he is fair. He is like my Cecilia, I think." Thorhild stood silent, looking down at her child. There was no great change to be seen in the housekeeper, though in some way she had grown younger and fairer. It was not only that her figure seemed yet more shapely. She was broad-shouldered and had always been high-bosomed, with a chest as deep and broad as a man's. But now her full, firm breast looked as if it would burst her kirtle, and this made her seem slighter in the waist. But it was not that alone. Her grey, bold-featured face had softened, as it were, and become younger. "He has no look of knowing what hunger is, this fellow," said Ingunn. "No, thank God," replied Thorhild quietly. "He doesn't know what it is, and with God's help he shall never know it either, so long as I am alive. You may be sure Olaf will see to it that the boy shall never lack anything, even if you be taken from him," said Ingunn in a low voice. "That I know full surely." Thorhild threw the cloth over her child again and lifted him in her arms. Ingunn held out her hand in farewell. Thorhild bent deeply over it and kissed it. Then Ingunn burst out. She could not keep back the words. "So, in the end, you got your old desire fulfilled, Thorhild." Thorhild replied calmly and with a mournful air, "I tell you, Ingunn, as truly as I hope in Christ and Mary Virgin for mercy for myself and this my child, I do not believe, mistress, that I ever desired to deceive you. And he, your husband, never desired it either. You must know it. But it came about nevertheless." Ingunn said bitterly, "Nevertheless I have seen it. Years before I lost my health, what thoughts you had of Olaf. You liked him better than all beside. And that has been so for more than 3 years or 4. Yes, from the time I knew him first, I have liked him best of all." She bowed stiffly and went out. Eirik started up, spat after the woman, and swore. His mother called to him in a hushed and frightened voice. "Eirik mine, be not so sinful. Never say those ugly words of any mother's child," she begged him, bursting into tears and trying to draw the boy to her. But he wrested himself from her and dashed out of the door.